We're going to begin a discussion of ecology and ecosystems, but before we get to that, I wanted to talk a little bit about population and population dynamics. If you were to talk or poll a room of ecologists, for example, and ask them, what they thought the most pressing issue of the last century and possibly in the first half of this century, the most important ecological issue. If you were to ask a group of ecologists that, I think the majority would point to the growth of human population, coupled with the lack of a change in behavior in human behavior in terms of consumption, basically be consumptive behaviors. Whereas if you were to ask a room full of the general public the same question, they would probably be all over the place. They'd say global warming might be an issue, ozone depletion, pollution, all kinds of things. But again, I think ecologists would view all of those other problems as being artifacts of a rapidly growing human population without any kind of really change in our behavior over the last several hundred years. So I want to look at that because as we look at ecology and issues related to ecology, a lot of them trace back to human population and our behavior. So looking at, and I'll also be looking at population dynamics in general, but also then relating that specifically to human population and human population growth. So what I'd first like you to do is just kind of look over this list, looking at how rapidly our population has grown, looking at a population estimate from 1200 through a projection through 2010. So we're looking at a growth from less than half a billion people, projected out to be, more than 7 billion by the end of the decade. So anyway, you can see this is growth has been especially acute here in the last couple of hundred years. And so, when we look at this on a graph, you can see that human population stayed pretty low until about 1,000 to 2,000 years ago, and then we were in this rapidly, exponentially growing population. Now, one of my problems with some of these numbers and estimates is I'm not sure that they accurately represent some of the population crashes we saw here in the New World as Europeans came to the New World and some of the native population crashes that we saw here. But generally speaking, you can't argue with the fact that presently we are growing and growing very rapidly. So when you look at populations in general, there are certain characteristics that we tend to see. When organisms are introduced into a new environment, there's usually a period of relatively slow growth, and this is known as a lag phase. And then if conditions are ideal or close to ideal, populations begin to grow very rapidly, and they'll exhibit what we consider logarithmic or exponential growth. And then a couple of things can happen. I think most people have this concept, and this is possible, that the population will eventually stabilize around what we call the carrying capacity. And I'll come back to that later, but basically it's the number of individuals that an ecosystem will support. And so ideally a population will stabilize around that. But there are other possibilities as well. Sometimes environmental conditions change, carrying capacity can be lowered, and so the population will crash to meet the new carrying capacity. And also in a rapidly growing population, it's also possible that a population can overshoot its carrying capacity, altering the ecosystem, again resetting the carrying capacity lower, which will eventually result in a crash as well. So as we look at human population, and you look at that previous graph that I showed you, we are exhibiting exponential growth. And we really don't know if we're down at the bottom here or at the top. And what we have to hope is that we are going to be able to stabilize as opposed to overshooting and possibly crashing as a result of that. So there's going to be a little bit of a theme here. I'm going to try not to be too pessimistic, but there is going to be a little bit of a doomsday theme to our module today. So bear with me. So anyway, when we look at natural populations, one that's been studied for a long time, for example, are lynx and snowshoe hare populations. These go back to population study go back really to the first Europeans coming to the continent. And when you look at these populations, you'll notice we don't see this nice, what we call a logistic curve, just a nice flat curve. We see these extreme undulations in populations. So I'll come back and address this kind of thing later, but again, we have to look at our own population and wonder what's going to happen. All we know about our own population right now is that we are in this extreme growth phase. Do we want to enter, one of these crash phases? I know I don't, and I hope you don't either. So as we look at changes in populations then, you have a population, and so some of the things that affect that certainly will be births. Births add new individuals, deaths take out individuals, and those are quote-unquote natural changes. And then we also have the effects in local populations of immigration, individuals coming in, and immigration with an E, individuals exiting. So these are factors which can affect the numbers of individuals in a population. So as we look at population growth in general, generally speaking, when we see exponential growth in a population, we refer to that as a J-curve. And so again, these are examples of populations growing exponentially. So they start off somewhat linearly and then curve into this more parabolic line. And so when we compare linear growth to exponential growth, when we look at linear growth, a linear series would be something like this: 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and so on. And if we were to look at the difference in each of these, then there's a difference of 2. So in linear growth, and it wouldn't have to be 2, it could be any number, but the point is that in linear growth, the rate of change is constant. So there's growth, but the rate of growth is constant. So at each step in our growth, we would have 2 in this case. So that produces linear growth. And when you plot that out, then we would see a straight line. And certainly that increases numbers potentially, but when we compare that to exponential growth or logarithmic growth, and a logarithmic or exponential series would be something like this: 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. It doesn't have to be a doubling series, but what's significant about this is that, for example, when we go from 2 to 4, that would be a difference of 2. From 4 to 8 is a difference of 4. 8 to 16, a difference of 8. 16 to 32, a difference of 16. The point is that the increase is increasing. Okay, so in this kind of a growth sequence, again, it doesn't have to be a doubling sequence, but the fact that the increase is increasing is what makes it an exponential growth. So that when you plot that out, what will happen is that your straight line will be curved, and that creates the J-curve. So when we see J-curves, that means that this is a very rapidly growing population. Now, a population that's growing in a J-curve and growing at its maximum possible growth rate is growing at what we call the biotic potential. So when conditions are ideal and a population is growing at its maximum growth rate, we consider that the biotic potential. And again, as we look at our own growth rate, we're close to that, probably. So we are just exploding in growth. Now, this J-curve then can also flatten out, as I showed you earlier, into what's known as a logistic curve or an S-curve. And so again, in an ideal world, after the lag phase exponential growth, population slows and stabilizes around carrying capacity. And so what will slow that and establish carrying capacity, what will slow biotic potential and establish carrying capacity, is what we call limiting factors. So first of all, carrying capacity itself is defined as the number of niche spaces available. But basically what that means is that it's the number of individuals of a particular type that an ecosystem will support. And again, the limiting factors will be those factors then that set carrying capacity and slow growth from the biotic potential. So limiting factors are generally separated into 2 types, so-called density-dependent limiting factors, whose effects vary depending how many individuals there are in a population, and then density-independent limiting factors. But let's look at the density-dependent limiting factors first. So density-dependent factors include several things, typically habitat. In other words, there's only so much room available, and that will have only so much food available, so much water available, so much shelter available, and so on. And so again, what may have been plenty of food, water, and shelter in a small population now suddenly becomes problematic if you double, triple, quadruple that population. So again, I might have a certain amount of food to get through the year for myself and my family. That might be an adequate amount of food. But if I had to share that with the entire city and all of their relatives, and even in other cities, that's suddenly now not going to be enough food to get through the year. So numbers influencing, having an influence on the effect is what we consider density-dependent factors. So disease also typically is density-dependent as well, because disease can be spread more easily as populations become more dense. And then also animal behavior can also be affected by density. So whereas animals in a low-density situation would not have any problem mating and would exhibit normal mating behavior, a lot of times with animals, when density gets too high, they may change their mating behavior, or they'll produce smaller litters, things like that. And again, this is one of the ways in which behavior can affect distribution, is that individuals may exhibit different types of behaviors who either clump together, or they may distribute themselves evenly, or in other patterns, or randomly. So again, plants we don't really think of in terms of having behavior, but animal behavior certainly can affect distribution. And again, this also relates to habitat as well. So, for example, depending on the topography and so on, if you had mountainous regions, for example, and maybe meadows, if it was some type of a plant or animal that was associated with meadows, then they would only be able to grow where the meadows are found. And so again, as density increases, that could affect whether individuals survive or not. Okay, density independent factors then would be those that are fairly consistent in their effect regardless of how many individuals there are. And so historically climate has been put into this category, but when we look at human population, certainly human population is having an effect on climate. So some ecologists will argue that there really are no independent density independent factors. But again, historically climate is put there. Again, also historically, the geography and geology of an ecosystem are typically put into the independent category. But again, some will argue that there's no such thing as density independent factors. And again, depending on the physical makeup of the ecosystem, that can affect distribution of plants and animals as well. All right, now, again, kind of getting back to population growth then, again, in an ideal world, we see this logistic curve, but in the real world, we typically, see dramatically undulating populations. And again, we've talked about this a little bit already. So again, the question is, where are we and what is our future? What's going to happen to human beings? We just know we're growing exponentially. What's the consequence of that? Now, when we look at populations, global population and also regional populations, and there are some statistical measures that we use to compare and evaluate populations. And so I am going to want you to be familiar with some of these and be able to actually calculate some of these. And so the first of these is birth rate. So birth rate is calculated by taking the number of live births in a year and dividing by an estimate of the mid-year population, so the population estimated in the middle of that year, and then you'll multiply that times 1,000. So when we look at birth rate, this is an expression of births per 1,000. And globally, that number is around 20 right now, although that number is coming down a little bit, to be honest with you, and I'll talk more about that later. Death rate then would be computed by taking the number of deaths in a year, dividing by the mid-year population, and again, expressed per 1,000, because when you take those numbers globally, especially, you end up with a very small number. So we multiply times 1,000 to get a more workable number. So per 1,000 people then, globally, about 20 people are born and about 8 will die. And so, again, one of the trends that we tend to see, certainly in the modern world as, medicine has improved and so on, that, our life expectancy has gone up, certainly as, death rate has decreased. So, death rate can be significant in terms of overall life expectancy and population growth. So from birth rate and death rate, then you can calculate what's known as the annual percentage growth rate. So this would tell us the percent of increase of our population. So you take the birth rate and the death rate and divide by 10. Because birth rate and death rate are expressed per 1,000, percent is expressed per 100, so you take your per 1,000, divide by 10, and that will give you per 100. So this is sometimes just called the growth rate or percentage growth rate. We're calling it the annual percentage growth rate. And so again, globally, 20 minus 8 divided by 10 would be 1.2%, so we're growing currently at about 1.2%, although that number has been coming down over the last decade, and it's projected to come down a little bit more as well. But let's kind of figure out what would happen. Let's say that the population stabilized at a growth rate of 1.2%. What would that mean? Would that mean then that population has stabilized? Would we stabilize at 7 billion people? If we had a growth rate of 1.2% for the next 10 years, would population stabilize over the next 10 years? Well, in thinking about that, let's compare that to a bank account. Let's say you're going to get 10% interest on an account, which would be great, wouldn't it? So just to make the numbers easy here. So let's say you had $100, you put it into a bank account and you get 10% interest. So you would make $10 that first year. Leave that into the account, let that roll over. So at the end of the year, you'd have $110. Then you get 10% of that the next year. So you'd make $11 the next year. So at the end of that year, you'd have $121. 10% of that, you'd be making $12.10. Add that in. Now you're up to over $133. Take 10% of that, you're going to make $13, 30 plus. So the point is that even though you would be at the same interest rate of 10%, what's actually happening to the increase? You made $10 the first year, $11 the next year, $12 the next year, $13 the next year. The increase is increasing. So even though the percentage growth rate may stabilize, the actual growth increases in terms of real numbers. And that's why, there's a saying, it's difficult to get rich fast, but it's easy to get rich slowly. So again, if you can put money, get a good interest account and leave it there, you'll eventually get rich. But in terms of population, what it translates to is rapid population growth. All right, so again, even though you may have stability in your growth rate, it is still a growth rate. So that means increase in numbers, and not just a linear growth, but an exponential growth. And so that's what we're currently experiencing, even though we've had some stability in our growth rate. Now, from the percentage growth rate, then you can also make an estimate of what's called doubling time. So this is actually not really considered a real number. It's mainly used for statistical comparisons of different populations, and it's based on the natural log of 2, but they take a constant 70 and divide by the percentage growth rate. And so again, if you took 70 divided by global growth of 1.2%, that would give you a doubling time of about 58 years. So again, it's mainly used for comparison, but it is actually fairly accurate when you look at the real world. And again, just to give you a sense of how rapidly population has doubled. In my own lifetime, I was born in 1954, population was 2.7 billion people when I was born. And it's currently about 7 billion people. So again, that's a pretty rapid growth just in my lifetime. So again, your lifetime may not be quite that fast, but most of you watching this, this module will see population double in your lifetime. Now, in addition then to the quote-unquote natural changes of birth and death, we also then have migration, individuals entering in and leaving populations. So immigration with an I is in, people coming in. Immigration with an E would be people leaving. So we can also compute net migration. So that would be the number of immigrants with an I minus the number of immigrants with an E, divided by your population times 1,000. So the same kind of things we've been doing. And then you can adjust a growth rate by taking your net migration, dividing by 10, and then adding that to the APGR. So again, you can't do this for global rates, of course, because people can't come to the Earth and leave the Earth, but you can do this by comparing populations of one country to another, one continent to another, and so on. And then finally, you then can adjust your doubling time to take 70 and divide by your adjusted growth rate, adjusted for migration. So let's take a hypothetical population and let's see how we would calculate these things. And again, if you're taking this class from me, I would be expecting you to be able to make these computations, potentially. So anyway, if we took these numbers, birth rate, 40,000 births in a year, 2 million deaths in a year times 1,000, you basically can multiply by 1,000 first, which would mean just add your 3 zeros here and then divide by 2 million, cancel your zeros, and then divide 2 into 40, and that would give you a birth rate of 40. Death rate, 20,000 deaths in a year divided by 2 million estimated mid-year population times 1,000 first. So we'll add those 3 zeros, then we'll cancel zeros. 20 divided by 2 would give us a death rate of 10. And again, this is just a hypothetical made-up population. How would we calculate these things? So from there, then we can calculate the annual percentage growth rate. 20 minus 10 divided by 10 would give us a growth rate of 1%. From that doubling time, 70 divided by our APGR, 1% would be equal to 70 years. So this population growing at 1%, we would estimate to double every 70 years. And then from those numbers, let's say that we had 12,000 individuals coming in, 2,000 leaving our population. So we'd multiply by 1,000 after doing our subtraction there, which gives us 10,000 times 1,000, which would be 10 million. And then cancel our zeros. And so our net migration then would be 5. So that would be an addition of 5 coming in per 1,000. And then we could adjust our growth rate by taking our net migration, divide by 10, and add that to our APGR. So 5 divided by 10 would be 0.5. Add that to our 1%. 1.5% would be our adjusted growth rate. And then finally, we could adjust our doubling time by taking the constant 70, dividing by our adjusted growth rate of 1.5%. And you'll see that in this adjusted population then, doubling time is a little over 46 years, almost 47 years. All right, now in addition to those values, there are other statistical measures that we use. One is total fertility rate. Total fertility rate, again, is kind of a statistician's invention. It's a projection of the number of children that a typical woman in a population will have in her lifetime. It's not really an average, it's something different than that. But again, it's a projection of a typical woman in a population. So replacement TFR economically developed countries is around 2.1, and in less developed countries it's much higher than that. So this is really a reflection of really healthcare in a population, infant mortality. The lower the infant mortality, the lower the replacement TFR. Because ideally, you'd think that it should be 2.0, but the point is that some individuals will always die without reproducing. So TFR will always be slightly higher than 2. Now, another statistical measure is typically called, or it has a number of names now, but it's sometimes called the average marrying age. And so this would be the average age at which a woman has her first child. And there's a relationship between the average marrying age and TFR, total fertility. And the relationship is that the younger a woman is when she has her first child, the more children she'll have in her lifetime. So when we look at certain countries and populations that have low AMAs, low average marrying ages, they tend to have high TFRs, and high TFRs also translate into high birth rates, growth rates for populations. In populations where you have women who are older when they have their first child, again, tend to have lower TFRs, and then that translates into lower growth rates typically. So again, these are inversely related. As one goes up, the other goes down. Also, we look at what are known as age distribution diagrams. And this can also give you a clue as to what's happening in the next generation or two in a population. And so you can see that age basically is on a vertical axis, and then we have the numbers of individuals of different ages along the horizontal axis. And they all taper at the top, so everybody's going to die eventually. But what's interesting about this is that if you look at basically the under 15 population, the lower third of our graphs typically, this is typical of a rapidly growing population. A lot of young individuals under the age of 15. In the next 15 years, they are going to move into reproductive age and have children of their own. And so there's typically a cultural inertia here. So if you come from a large family, you tend to want to have a large family. So this is very typical of rapidly growing populations, generally less economically developed countries. When you see more or less parallel lines here on the side, this would be a relatively stable growth or slow growing population, somewhat like the United States actually, and some Western European countries. And then here where it's actually tapered at the bottom, this would actually be a population that's in a negative growth. So again, there are some Western European countries that actually are declining in population. But overall, there's a net growth because again, in the less economically developed countries, we see rapid growth. All right, so when we compare the more economically developed countries to less economically developed countries, again, we tend to see some general trends. APGRs will be low in the more developed countries, much higher in the less economically developed countries. Doubling times will be higher here, lower here. TFRs, lower here, higher here. And the age structure diagrams will be will not be bottom heavy in the more developed countries and very bottom heavy in the less developed countries. So again, it gives you a sense of what's going to happen in the next generation or two. Now, when we look at human population in terms of our own carrying capacity, really we don't know human carrying capacity. And it's tied largely to the quality of life that we want to have. How do we want to eat? How do we want to live? How much energy can we consume? Those kinds of things. So again, what our future is, in some part, depends upon what kind of life we want to have in the future. So one of the questions then, should population growth be slowed? And again, that's a major debate. There's no real answer to that. I mean, most ecologists would think, yeah, we need to slow growth. We don't know what the consequences of rapidly growing population are going to be. We don't want to end up like a snowshoe hare or lynx population with, a huge crash. We should try to anticipate what's potentially could happen. But the economic side of this is that it's hard to have a growing economy when you don't have more people. And so economists are happy to have more people. And so that's the other side of this, that politically, the economy is a very important political topic. And so, why would you not want to have a growing population if that can help get you elected? So this is not something that you really hear on the political stage. But again, we do have some things that we have to face in our future that are consequences of a rapidly growing population. Do we want to end up like the lynx, the snowshoe hare, or do we want to have a logistic curve? What are we going to do? So if we agree that we do want to slow growth, again, there's some things that can occur. And so again, generally speaking, when you look at economically developed countries, population growth is relatively slow there. And so there are some related concepts here. Certainly the education of women is important. This is related to economic development, also the empowerment of women. So again, in more economically developed countries, women tend to go to school. They tend to go to secondary education, higher education. And so that tends to delay having the first child because women will going to get an education. They also then enter the workplace and establish careers. And as a consequence, they'll tend to have their first child at an older age than women do in less economically developed countries where their primary value many times is to produce children. We need workers for the fields, that kind of thing. So in the more economically developed countries, women have a different value. They have a true economic value to the economy. Also, they tend to delay the first child, which lowers TFR and lowers growth overall. Additionally, family planning. In economically developed countries, again, women are planning their future. Going to go to school, start a career, then have a family. And there's a certain reality to life, and it is that families that are planned tend to be smaller than families that are not planned. If it's just, hey, whatever happens, happens, you're going to have a big family. So family planning also has an economic tie to it in that you have to be able to afford family planning. You have to be able to afford birth control. You have to have access to birth control, those kinds of things. Also, if you know that your children will live, if there's good health care, you tend to have fewer children. If you know you're going to be burying your children, you'll want to have lots of children so that hopefully they survive. So that is also an aspect of this which is important. And certainly an extreme way to control population growth is what we see in China, where they actually have reproductive laws. And so, certainly we're nowhere near that in our country and most of the free world, but that is an approach that they have taken in China. And China has had tremendous success with this. So again, what they looked at was the projection of food production and the projection of population growth. They knew they had a problem. They wouldn't be able to produce enough food for all the people. And so they used a series of incentives and penalties to encourage adhering to the quote-unquote one-child policy of that country. So ultimately, I think what has been most successful about that policy in China is that peer pressure plays a role because they've been able to tie their growing economy to this one-child policy. And so also, because of the penalties and incentives that go on, people tend to report people who are having children illegally. So anyway, hopefully we never get to that, but certainly population growth is a concern for ecologists. So that's it for today. See you next time.